right, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Maria Lipinski. I'm the director of the Health and Risk Communication Center here in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, and I'm also a faculty member appointed in the Department of Communication and Michigan Ag Bio Research. I'd like to start first by extending my big welcome to many of our guests today. We have many of our alum, we have friends of the college here today, so thank you all for joining us. And go green, it's a big weekend for us, right? So welcome to all of you. The annual Bettinghaus lecture focuses on issues regarding health and risk communication and is made possible by an endowment gift from Irv and Kay Bettinghaus. This lecture is jointly organized by the Department of Communication and the Health and Risk Communication Center. This lecture honors Dr. Irwin P. Bettinghaus, former professor in the Department of Communication, its chairperson, and the Dean of Deans, as we called him. He was the dean of this college, the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, from 1976 to 1996, which is a long time to be a dean. Our dean will tell us. Irv Bettinghaus played the initial key role in introducing communication research to the broader world of public health. He served many different roles around the country and around the world and really brought health communication to the National Institutes of Health and to the National Cancer Institute, in particular at the National Institutes of Health, to USAID and World Health Organization and other places. In so doing, he raised the profile of communication at NCI and at other federal agencies. Today's talk is a very exciting one here in the college because we are excited to have one of our own back, Dr. Cami Silk. Please join me. Dr. Silk, who got her doctorate at the University of Georgia, is the Rosenberg Professor and Chairperson of the Department of Communication at the University of Delaware. There's a little tear that's going down my cheek right now because I miss her. She previously served as a Senior Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Department of Communication and Michigan Ag Bio. She is a health and risk communication scholar with an international reputation who investigates how to promote positive health outcomes among the lay public. Her recent research has focused on health issues of breast cancer risk reduction, suicide prevention, and improving nutritional practices among adolescent mothers for obesity reduction. She is a researcher with the Breast Cancer in the Environment Research Program, where she serves as the PI of 2 NIEHS, that's National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, grants, and a co-I of another breast cancer project. Her work on breast cancer includes research and outreach activities designed to educate girls, parents, and pediatric healthcare providers about the links between the environment and breast cancer. She is going to talk to us today about this incredible program of research. This is something that has, I mentioned this at the forum earlier, this is something that has brought together faculty from a range of disciplines, advocates, scientists, et cetera. So like biologists, rat runners as we might call them, from all over the place to address issues around breast cancer and the environment. Dr. Silk, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Well, thanks, Maria. Thanks. It's good to be back. I feel like I never left, but I think I had to leave to get invited back to do this, so maybe this is all coming full circle here or something. So I just want to kind of say, I think this was a really difficult talk to think about for me because it's sort of like coming home and being judged by my peers and things like that. But then I also knew that this Day of Innovation was happening as well. And I thought, well, there's going to be a lot of public health folks in the audience. So I thought it was a good idea to tell a story today about what we've been doing for the last 16, 17 years. And so there's a little bit of something, I hope, for everybody in it. The nice thing about the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program is its emphasis not just on research, but the outreach. And so this is sort of this combined twofer for me today. You'll learn a bit about breast cancer and the environment, of course, and it'll count as a sort of an outreach activity too, not just a research presentation. So this is a good thing. So just as with, let me find this clicker. I'm not really a clicker person, but it's probably a good idea for this talk. Here we go. The funding acknowledgements, and there's a few because we've been funded for 17 years straight with different mechanisms to do this work. So we have to thank the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences quite a bit. And I wouldn't get anything done without partners. So we have we have the early crew, a former dean who's now president of some university in Georgia. And we have, of course, Sandy Smith, looking like she hasn't changed a bit since then. And then we also have Chuck Atkin, who was the person who invited me to be part of the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program submission. So a little bit of luck there in that it hit. And then when I started here, I immediately started working on breast cancer and the environment and have worked on that ever since. So, but if you take a look, that's a lot of people. A lot of those names from the MSU graduate students, those, I went through the Vita just to kind of pull out everybody who was on something that we published, and it's sort of a lot of folks. And it goes from most recent back to the early days with people like Marissa Ferrara and Renee Strom. So I want to give a shout out to MSU Extension. Because of the requirements of the grant, you really do need some partners. And MSU Extension, if you don't know about them, you should really be reaching out to work with them because they're wonderful. And then we work with a lot of advocates, which you'll learn a little bit more about. And then I want to say something nice about Sima Finn, who I think for Sandy and I was a program officer who really advocated for us to be able to do the most recent R21 work that we were able to do. So making those partnerships with program officers really does make a difference sometimes. So she's going to retire too, so it's good to do that. So some background for you today for sure. We'll take a look at some fun findings and take a look at some of the recent projects. We've been partnering a bit with WKAR over the last few years, so you'll see some videos. And then I think some of the ongoing communication challenges that we face when we're talking about emerging science and how do you really communicate emerging science. So some disease information. We can't really talk about breast cancer without talking about why would we spend this kind of money to study this disease. So when you take a look at the cancers that impact women, it's the biggest one. It's 30%. Of all the cancer cases in 2019 are estimated, 30% are estimated to be breast cancer. So it's at the top of the list for female health. If you take a look at this one, this is top 10 cancers by rates of new cancer cases on the left. So again, it shows sort of the same data in that females are suffering and suffering at greater rates than maybe even our males who have prostate cancer. And then you have deaths associated with breast cancer, which, look at that over there. It's the second bar down. Look, I have this. I could probably use it and show you that, 20. So these are rates of cancer deaths. And compared to all types of cancer, it's second for females. So you take a look at trends in cancer incidence rates. And whoa, a little happy there. And you can sort of see this nice decrease. And you can even see a dip there. That dip is probably due to hormone replacement therapy not being prescribed anymore. But what this doesn't really show really well is that breast cancer rates are actually on an increase of about 0.4% a year. So it's not this downward trend as we might hope. Certainly it's better treatment, early detection, it's all better than it was for sure. But we are not necessarily solving a problem here. I like this one. You can go look these up. These are CDC data. These are CDC data. And I'm not sure what I think about this, but they make some estimates that if the cancer rates had sort of continued at the rate they were, and there wasn't a new early detection and treatment, then we would still be there, but we have, so we've actually saved, this many deaths. And I thought that was an interesting way to frame it, but I think it gives sort of a positive take on efforts are working a bit, so we should continue. I thought that was a different kind of slide. And so if you just take a look, my summation here is all ages, number of cases. Here you've got an increase recently in the last 10 years or so of younger women with breast cancer too. And that doesn't seem to be completely due to the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene either. So that's a concern right there. The biggest risk factor for breast cancer is getting older. Yeah. A lot of people think it's your family history, but it's actually not. And the genetic piece that people put a lot of emphasis on, while it's certainly important, particularly you have the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene, it's not necessarily the full story. And for most of us who get breast cancer, we don't have any family history of it. So it's tricky. Take a look here. I was a little dismayed at this one because I moved to Delaware, second in the country, right, in terms of cancer rates. It's a hot spot. A woman named Steingraber about 20 years ago wrote a book called Living Downstream. And she kind of did this heat map of, not too dissimilar to this, of places in the country where there are these high cancer rates. And you'd see them in the expected areas up through the Northeast corridor here, because lots of industry and manufacturing and really environmental things that that might cause cancer. But then you would see them sort of out in these little specks of cancer clusters through here. And so then she took a look and she's like, what's the difference? Well, it's because they have the big manufacturing plants in these rural areas. And so you start sort of getting that correlational story that, yeah, it's a problem. The environment maybe has some impact here. So it's tricky. Well, risk communication is probably tricky, but most established risk factors, gosh, I really want to push that, forge ahead here. Most established risk factors have modest association. So unlike HPV and cervical cancer or smoking and lung cancer, you take a look at breast cancer and there's like a list of like 20 things that could be related. And so they all have these modest associations. And a lot of the risk remains unexplained. And then the things that are risk factors aren't necessarily conducive to population level types of intervention. So it's often put on the individual to make the change, eat healthy, exercise, avoid certain chemicals, right? So it's on the individual, So then you're dealing with everything causes cancer beliefs, like, well, what is it this year? What am I going to see in the news? Avoid this, drink red wine, don't drink red wine, have hormone replacement therapy, don't have hormone, it's emerging all the time. And so everybody has this heuristic that, what should I do? There's probably nothing because everything seems to cause cancer. You've heard that statement, everything causes cancer, right? Overemphasis on family history. So if I don't have the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene, then I'm probably okay. Nah, not really how it works, right? It's not a personal disease priority for many people. This was one of those moments I remember so distinctly at one of our conferences where all the breast cancer advocates are sitting around the table and why don't people do this and why don't they care? And I'm like, because they don't. Because they care more about diabetes, because that's their family history. They care more about cardiovascular disease. So I want to break it to you, but not everybody cares about breast cancer, right? And that was sort of this moment where they're like, wow. I'm like, yeah, that's what you're up against. Not everybody cares like you care, right? We all think our self-involvement is indicative of everybody else's interest too. Scientific literacy and low understanding that evidence evolves over time. I always go back to this as an enormous barrier that science isn't stagnant. We don't learn something and then it always stays the same, and that's our finding. And we're going to act on that, especially within health. Science is emerging, and certainly with the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program. So that takes us, so you sort of have the breast cancer background a little bit. So let's talk about the BSERP. It's an unusual program. So I wanted to talk about activism. I actually got to write a cool article with a bunch of advocates that really traced breast cancer activism. So this is the 1-minute version of that. And if you take a look, in the 40s, there was the American Society for Control of Cancer, and it changes to the American Cancer Society. You see sort of, and this is like not a very comprehensive, but there's a lot of activity that gives us an understanding of why breast cancer is so heavily funded because of all of the activism and advocacy over the years. So you've got the Feminine Mystique written, you've got in the 70s all kinds of things going on. The 70s were pretty radical here, and the way to treat was radical mastectomies. You've got the Boston Women's Health Collective, you've got Title IX, you've got Betty Ford and Happy Rockefeller really for the first time talking about breast cancer in public, where cancer was the C word, okay? It was the C word in the past before then. So it becomes sort of more out in the public view. You also have, with Title IX, women who are now becoming surgeons, who are getting admission into medical schools and then graduating in the 80s, then being the surgeons and questioning some of the treatments. In the 80s, we see support groups, different breast cancer organizations, Susan B. Komen, Susan Love, who's one of the most famous breast cancer surgeons, on her group. And you just see this evolution happening. In the 90s, even more activity. Because of the whole Clarence Hill thing, Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill thing, that whole piece, you see more women being elected to Congress, which then creates sort of the will, perhaps, for some more funding. And you see this activism, you see the Long Island breast cancer study, so now you have rich women advocating over time, and there's a lot of rich women over time who are the ones who were the leaders in terms of advocating for more research dollars for it. The establishment of the DoD breast cancer research program, and then you've got all of these other groups, and in San Francisco in particular, a lot of activism happening there. And so lobbying in 1993 begins, and not until 2002. When I say lobbying, this is by advocates are saying, the environment, we gotta look at the environment, we gotta look at the environment. It took a decade for them to listen. And they had some stakeholder meetings led by Gary Oldman at the time, and so this is a little bit of a history lesson for y'all, who was really willing to listen to advocates. And the advocates they lobbied hard, they went to Congress, they were just amazing. And that finally led to this RFA. And the first sentence of it is kind of monumental. First time this was kind of language you would see in a call from NIH. They wanted applications to create research centers where multidisciplinary teams, we now call that transdisciplinary, scientists, clinicians, breast cancer advocates work collaboratively, look at that, advocates, right? On a unique set of scientific questions that focus on these factors and how the environment work together with genetic factors to cause breast cancer. So this was monumental. The other thing that was monumental about it was funded, if you were funded, you were actually funded for 7 years, which was unusual because it's usually a 5-year cycle. Thus you have 5-year survival rates. People give that great meaning, but really it emerged because that was the funding cycle, 5 years, okay? So we shouldn't underestimate the power of 5-year survival rates, right? It means something. It is monumental, but that's the origin. So what's transdisciplinary? So these are these teams of researchers. We're working together across disciplines to develop research questions. When you think about breast cancer, it is beyond any single discipline to be able to solve that problem, right? So you've got to work together in a team and hopefully in a coordinated fashion to help make progress and move the needle more quickly. So the other big piece of this is there's a prominent interest in translating scientific knowledge into practical applications. And that was sort of the origin of the COTC, which is the group that Sandy and I have been part of, the Communication, Outreach, and Translation Core, which then changed names, lots of acronyms here, to Communication, Outreach, and Dissemination. I always think it's community or communication, but the C stands for one of those two things. So the structure, it's fascinating to me as a sort of OrgComm interested person of the structure of this. So currently, and this of course creates, just look at this, it creates work. It creates meetings, creates a bureaucracy that's really difficult at times for me to stomach it. I'm not gonna lie. It's a lot of time on calls and things. But there's a coordinating center, there's working groups, and then these 6 projects that were funded. And this is ours here. Richard Schwartz is our PI. Mammary carcinogenesis, pubertal and adult effects of high-fat diet plus oxybenzone. So he's doing the animal studies here. Basically, he was required to have advocates and communication folks involved. So it's kind of nice. It's a great setup for communication folks. You take a look, this was something that we recently published in breast cancer research, and it was a big team effort of like 15 of us giving our little pieces to this, but ultimately there's this model that they were taking a look in this particular, these last 5 years, 4 different windows of susceptibility with these different chemical exposures, looking at these mechanisms and pathways and the endpoints, the outcomes here. So, and we've got communications research. That kills me. I couldn't get that out. I just couldn't. It's communication research, and no one's a communications major, but a lot of people think they are. So anyway, that's there. So we're sort of part of the process, but it doesn't weigh prominently within this particular model, that's for sure. So translational research. So I'm going to do a couple of definitions because it's going to be sort of this consistent reference back to these things throughout the rest of the presentation. So when you think about translational research, different models exist. This is one of them. Translational 1, 2, T1 is when you're taking a look at new ways to diagnose a disease. T2, translation of results from clinical studies into everyday clinical practice and health decision making. I think this is our space that we reside in most of the time. And I think that our researchers in the BSERP reside here because we have our lab-based researchers working with our epidemiologists to help stimulate robust scientific understanding. So people have asked, do you think the BSERP is effective in terms of, is it a better model? And I'm not 100% sure, and I don't have empirical evidence to suggest that it is better than individual approaches. But I will say that there's a speediness to the delivery of findings. So twice a year we meet, scientists talk to each other, and I have seen them pivot away from things after they share findings and move in different directions in terms of chemical exposures they might investigate. So there's something about the speed of the science being shared amongst scientists that I think is the case. So maybe that's a very positive outcome. And the focus on, the communication and prevention, risk reduction piece of this, I think is very important too, because oftentimes research doesn't reach the public. And I'll go back to a very simple idea of taxpayer dollars fund this research, right? So why shouldn't we have a mechanism that goes directly back so that it's lay friendly for individuals? Precautionary principle, better safe than sorry. This is a principle that everyone on the BSERP adheres to, theoretically. Now, I think that the scientists are very different in their orientation in terms of wanting to share information less quickly than the advocates, and that's an ongoing tension that will always be the case. The advocates, any single study that has perhaps a disturbing finding, they would immediately like to share that in major ways, develop campaigns around it. Not so much with the scientists, not enough information. Makes sense, we all have a scientific orientation. But this is an approach that we adopt. And in our messaging, we have adopted this approach too. Windows of susceptibility, this is a really critical concept. And it's this idea that there are certain windows during your lifetime where you are more susceptible to increased breast cancer risk based on your exposures. Think about this. There's 7 down here. Right now, the original BSERP, the first rendition of it, only focused on those 2. Recently, in the last 10 years, they've expanded, probably 7 years, expanded it to these 5 windows. So think about this, though. And these are all times where there's lots of hormonal changes and cellular growth, and it leaves women susceptible. But when you think about, these are really specific time frames where if during these times I can reduce my daughter's exposures during these times, it can actually make a difference in their breast cancer risk, right? So it's helpful information to understand what this means. It has great implications. So endocrine disruptors. So these are bad, okay? These things can mimic, block, or interfere with natural hormones. They are found in everyday products like plastic bottles. Think about BPA, metal food cans, PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, detergents, flame retardants, food, toys, all these different things. So if you can identify them, you may try to avoid them in the future. So endocrine disruptors are what the chemical compounds that are being studied throughout BSERP. So now some storytelling. So the logo. So we sort of got some breast cancer statistics. We kind of get the orientation of the BSERP. So now let's add in some of the early years of the BSERP for a moment. So when I first showed up at the first meeting, my first semester here at MSU, I went to Princeton, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and the scientist looked at me and said, I think we need a logo. Now, those of you who know me know this is beyond my skill set. So I do what I thought, well, I'm going to play ball, I'm going to go make a logo and whatever, and Chuck and I would chat about what we could do, and and we ended up doing some focus groups to start like our first year. But that is pervasive for communication people. This idea that you're going to show up and make stuff, okay? And some of us have that skill set, and some of us in this room have awesome skill sets because of the arts in our college, right? But some of us do not. And so I did what people do. I came back and found a graduate student with a skill set, and they helped make this logo that has lasted the entire 17 years. So yay. Sandy did some work, and she led the memorable message work, and I have tons of references, of 25 papers that we've published. But I always think people can read a paper, right? It's kind of good to hear the background and stuff, but I've got some data for you too. And then we've done some work with health literacy and with making sure messages are accessible. And then we did some content analysis early on. Pam and Chuck led those up, taking a look at newspaper coverage and really showing that people focus on treatment and not prevention. Just not prevention. Detection, treatment, but not prevention. And then the focus group work that this was like my kickoff to focus groups, folks. I turned into the focus group queen after this. So just to give you a sense of some of our early message testing. So we had mothers and we found out that they're key audience here. And wow, I feel like, so here we go. So what messages or development, I feel like I've messed up my slides here and they're in the wrong order, but let me just make sure. Yeah. So anyway, our focus group research indicated that there's a lot of concern for daughters' breast health. And it's not taught in schools. It's not a focus in schools. But they have lots of health classes. They have the puberty talks in 5th, 6th grade, those kinds of things. But breast cancer breast health isn't really talked about. And then so we decided we should think about what we could do stepping into this. Source credibility, we know is important. And this was one of Chuck's thoughts, is findings don't really distinguish between types of expert sources. We know expert sources are good, but as a physician, better than a researcher. Who do you want to hear from? And then personalized language may yield more influence than less personal language, and then the behavioral intention, behavior link. So we developed some messages, lifestyle, chemical, or development, and we tested them, looking at involvement, looking at credibility. So 2 by 2 by 3, 600 women, most of them white, a lot of them breast cancer advocates. We were sort of snowing this one, and we've got advocate friends, so we got a lot of advocates participating. You can sort of see, not a great sample, but moms. It's kind of the background and the message a little bit. And the message concepts that we've really focused on were understanding normal mammary gland development. So your daughter's going through puberty, so maybe you want to pay attention and check in with her on that. Limiting exposures to chemicals, so maybe not buying products that have certain chemicals, and then overall adoption of healthy lifestyles. We used as a source a real person, Janet Osuch, so, we manipulated her to be, because she's actually both, but in messages as a breast cancer researcher or as an MD. And then we manipulated language that was you, your, women, and more less focused. Well, that was bad. All right. So we presented research. We acknowledged the inconclusive nature of evidence. So saying that, it's sort of emerging, but the precautionary principle matters, so you should think about these things, and then do these behaviors. So that was essentially the content of the messages. And so it was pretty okay. 3.46 above the midpoint here. The lifestyle and chemical messages seem to work a little bit more in terms of impacting intentions, and that was sort of one of my earliest projects with the BSERP. Source credibility, I always thought this was very interesting, but not necessarily overly surprising. But the lay audiences really preferred physician sources, and when you think about it, they have relationships with their physician, and people trust their physician, so that made sense to me. The advocates were interesting. They had a slight edge, the researchers. And advocates just think a lot of docs are not, current in terms of their understanding of the research. So that didn't surprise me that was a little bit lower, but not significant. So we didn't support the personalized language hypothesis, didn't make a difference on ratings. And self-efficacy and response efficacy, we also took a look at that. And that's always been an important part of what we it's important in the literature. We all know self-efficacy matters, response efficacy matters. But it's something that we've always measured. It's something we've always tried to emphasize in our messaging too. That, yep, you can do this. It's easy to do these things. And it can really work in terms of reducing your exposures. So both sources credible. Mothers and sources require specific message recommendations. And I think the big piece is people need to feel like they can engage in whatever the recommendation is. And this becomes problematic when some of our messages say things like XYZ chemical may contribute to. They do not want to hear that kind of language. They absolutely want more directive language, but then as researchers we know overly directive, reactants, right? So anyway, so there's a lot of challenges here. So, just jumping through to the later years, we did a lot of qualitative and quantitative testing of different risk messages for mothers. And I would say we did some work that had much more of a theoretical orientation, but we've done a lot of work that's more translational and applied type of research. The qualitative and quantitative testing on a bunch of different types of messages over time that led us to where we are now with some of the video work that we've done. We've done some training, multi-site training and data collection, so partnering across the country with advocates to train them to do focus groups, and then having them collect those data and then analyzing it all. And then the PFOA website study was probably one of my favorite studies because it really showed that something that was interesting and significant. So here's one of our message studies. And you can sort of see you've got the BPA focus, the PFOA in the middle, and then sort of the healthy lifestyle type of thing. The manipulations in here, we explain BPA, what it is, what the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program, and where to learn more information, looking for a label, making sure she's trying to sort of, I did not use a professional designer for these, but they seemed kind of clean, and so we tested these. And so, what do we find? You've got over here, the different accuracy, believability, usefulness, understandability, photo effectiveness. So we were really trying to look at the practical piece of what do these messages need. You can see some differences here. These two are different from each other. You can sort of read the data here, and overall, this is not a 1 to 5 scale. This is a 1 to 3 scale, which is unusual. I'm not sure. I can't remember why we would choose 1 to 3 because usually we have 1 to 5, 1 to 7, but. And then the effectiveness, you can sort of see some of the differences there. And the photo effectiveness, one of the things that I've come to believe as time has passed is that message consumers expect quality. They expect, compared to when I first started out, they don't want crayon messages. They don't want things that look like I put them together, right? They don't. They have a high quality expectation. And that has influenced my thinking in terms of how to write a grant and include that expertise in it, and making sure that we have it, because in today's world, like, everybody can create amazing messages, right? They have tools to do that. So you got it, and you're competing with all this stuff, so you better have a high quality message. So this is one of my favorite studies for just because of the one big finding. So there's this idea, if you use videos and make things more engaging, and you can show people things, that should lead to greater behavior change. So we developed 2 websites that were about 7 pages that were exactly the same, controlled completely, with the exception of, so that's the researcher. We inputted a video in one, or just had that picture of her in the other one. And we exposed people to it, a couple hundred mothers of young daughters, made sure, did the analytics to make sure they actually were on there looking at it for a while. Did time 1 and time 2 post-tests, measured a bunch of things. And here's the time 1, and you see a couple things that aren't particularly surprising. You see big knowledge gain, but the susceptibility and what is this one? Self-efficacy, some intentions, maybe. So that's great. Look at this. The video's doing pretty well here. A little bit heightened over here. Some significant differences between them. That's great. And at that time too, so about 2 weeks later, we follow up with them and we ask them, have you engaged in any of their recommended behaviors? And lo and behold, down here, actual behaviors performed, we get almost like a whole behavior. But they did more just because they were in the video condition. That was exciting at the time. I still find it exciting. That's why I said we should talk about this today. But you know, I think we make assumptions sometimes, so it was a really fun thing. And having Evan Peralt was great because he was a former news producer and reporter, so he really had a great skill set to create some of these videos and things that we've done in the past. So current research. So Oxybenzone. So this is I'll get to this in a second, breast density, CME, and diffusion of innovation experiments. So I'm just going to talk about each of these things for a few minutes. So oxybenzone is found in sunscreen. And so think about this. Oxybenzone is not great. The animal studies are showing that, you know, tumors grow when exposed to high doses. Human studies aren't quite so conclusive because you really, you know, it's not. So there's a little bit of, I would say even in our BSTRP calls right now, a little bit of tension between two researchers, the animal studies versus the epi folks, on what we're allowed to communicate about oxybenzone. So for me, I think, okay, so am I asking people to choose between skin cancer or breast cancer risk? What am I asking them to do? So am I telling them, don't use sunscreen? Now there are behavior adaptation models that would suggest we should just, well, maybe they should just wear a long shirt and they should wear a hat with a rim and they should not go out during certain hours. That doesn't work for everybody, right? If you're a farmer or something, or you are a lifeguard, there are some things you can do that are not about sunscreen though. But the other problem is the ones that don't have it, like the zinc oxide that's solid, is more expensive, and the ones that don't have this particular chemical are usually more expensive. So now we're creating perhaps a disparity amongst folks. So it's complicated. But, and the science isn't in yet completely, let's be clear. Now, this is from one of our advocate groups on Long Island, who they just take information and run with it, and they can because they're an advocate group, and that's what they do. But this is what they've proposed. So we, as part of our outreach efforts, would go to the teddy bear picnic on campus at MSU, where there's all kinds of parents milling about. Many of you have been to the teddy bear picnic, where the kid brings their bear and they can get, you know, health checkups and for the bear and pick up a bike helmet and this kind of thing. And so I figured, well, we should collect some data. So we got our clipboards out, we went, and we took a look at people's just perceptions of breast cancer versus skin cancer. And it's kind of interesting. You know, I don't see anything particularly surprising here, but what I think it is confusing for people, okay? So, and I take a look at, for instance, we asked about genetic determinism, like how much breast cancer is associated with genes versus skin cancer. And so of course, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 thing drives this, but it's also sort of this problematic thing where they're overestimating the role here still. That still is this pervasive idea. They feel pretty good about being able to do skin cancer prevention, that they could actually do something about it. They have higher self-efficacy when it comes to putting sunscreen on. You know, severity, it's all bad. Skin cancer, one a little bit over here, but you take a look at the confidence intervals and they kind of, overlap quite a bit. So people feel pretty susceptible. So I keep wondering what to do about this. We collected these data 2 years back, and I thought, okay, this is our first step in sort of understanding how people are thinking about breast cancer and skin cancer so that we're poised to start thinking about messaging around oxybenzone. And I haven't felt like we've had the green light to be able to actually do something real, like the advocacy group talked about. So in their poster here, like So I'm sort of stuck. I'm stuck with what to do with oxybenzone right now. Breast density notification laws. And this is Dan. This is a shout out to Dan Totske, who what kept coming up in a lot of our formative research was concern about breast density. And I didn't even hear about breast density 5 years ago. I didn't even know what it was about. But sure enough, if you take a look, people have more dense breasts. If you have more dense breasts, you have difficulty. It's more difficult to read your mammogram. These days, people are suggesting that 3D mammograms are more efficient. But actually, there are clinical trials right now that are sort of demonstrating that that has a lot more false positives as well. So don't know, but just know some folks who are actually enrolled in the clinical trial who are sharing that information. It's like, wow, that's interesting. So, so are breast density notifications effective? And I would say, based on Dan's, preliminary data, not so much. Not so much. People get this information and they don't really know what they're supposed to do. It's one of those contact your doctor moments. And if you're in Michigan, there's 32 states that have these laws that say that if you have any kind of dense breast density, and let's be clear, about 80% of women have some level of breast density, right? 80%. You can see the difference here. But if you're this person, you're not going to get a letter. But if you're these three, you're going to get a letter, okay? Where maybe the biggest risk is down here, but everybody's getting this letter. So again, what to do about that? So now we have policies following advocacy actually creating this policy that I wonder is as effective as people thought it would be. So this is where we are now. Continuing medical education for pediatric healthcare providers. So over the years, there was interest in communication research. And then there are actually calls designed for breast cancer and communication research. And so Sandy and I applied for this funding. There are a couple other communication scholars in our discipline who've been funded through this mechanism too, through NIEHS. And this evolved out of this commitment to communication research by specifically, I would say, even Sima Finn and Liam O'Fallon, who run the PEPH group at NIEHS. And so throughout my entire time with BSERP, everybody would talk about, we need to get to the physicians, we need to talk to the physicians, they need to be sharing this information. And so we thought, well, this made sense to try to develop this. So we did some formative research with pediatric healthcare providers and found out that they really did have low knowledge about breast cancer in the environment, not a big surprise, and that they really didn't know windows of susceptibility. But when they heard about windows of susceptibility, that captured their interest. And it was a hook to kind of draw them into thinking that this was important and something that they might want to share with their pediatric patients. So we developed a training. We had a scientific advisory group. We worked with WKAR. And so here's my shout out to WKAR. We have great resources in this college to help you build stimuli, to help you do outreach, to help you be a public scholar in any way that you want to be too. And I would say use those resources. And we did script writing. This was my first go around. I didn't really understand what it took to develop a high quality CME training and how on top of it we had to be. It took us over a year to develop these scripts, honestly, to get them right and to go through the advisory process. So it takes time to do these things, and that was hard. And Maddie Mulroy was the leader of that particular. So we developed 3 modules. And I think they're really designed to complement each other and to be reinforcing. And so module 1 is sort of the entry-level BSERP, talk about the precautionary principle, but then it gives a little bit of information about the other 2 modules. And the same thing with module 2, where it's more focused on the endocrine disruptors piece, but then it kind of gives a summary of 1 and 3, and then you got to get the summary, and then you get the communication piece. And the thought was that we all know frequency matters in terms of remembering something and in terms of transferring behavior. There's a whole training literature out there that talks about training transfer. And so how do you get people, it can't just be the knowledge thing. So you've got to kind of hit the frequency piece a lot. And so to me, these things are good pedagogically in terms of being reinforcing of each other. And if you only got one, and you'd get enough. You'd get enough. So we had a pre-post, and 3 to 4 week post-test design, and we ultimately decided to evaluate these 2 because the grant was framed as a feasibility study. And in terms of resources, it was difficult to be able to do all 3. So we have 100 participants. 50 of them were nurse practitioners, and 50 of them were pediatricians. And we have been partnering And what a painful partnership at times when you're working with certain organizations to get them to move at the pace you'd like them to. And so ultimately, though, the Michigan State Medical Society is offering our CME credit, so it's up. So physicians across the world can actually do it, which is great. So here's a clip. Results showed that while providers considered preventive action for breast cancer to be important, there was a lack of awareness surrounding windows of susceptibility and potential environmental risk factors. Again, as defined by the BSERP, the windows of susceptibility are specific life stage periods when the breast may be more vulnerable to environmental exposures. These windows include in utero, neonatal, pre-puberty, puberty, pregnancy, lactation, menopause. Caregivers expressed a desire for this information, agreeing that if they knew about the prepubertal and pubertal windows of susceptibility, they would be more likely to act in protecting their daughters from these environmental risk factors.
BSERP has identified many possible breast cancer risk factors. These include environmental exposures and lifestyle behaviors. The environmental exposures include a group of chemicals called endocrine disruptors, which mimic or interfere with the function of hormones like estrogen and progesterone in the body.
So that was a clip, and you'll see that we tried to incorporate evidence to say other physicians, healthcare providers actually thought this was important, and you should do this. So another one, this is where we invoke actors. So check this one out.
Module 3 focuses on communication strategies for providers to consider as they interact with pediatric patients and caregivers. The current module will introduce communication strategies and provide specific information and supplemental materials to aid healthcare providers in their discussions of BSERP risk factors with pediatric patients and their caregivers. While this may be a difficult topic to discuss with caregivers and young girls, there are strategies and supplemental materials provided in this training that should help providers feel comfortable with communicating about breast cancer environmental exposures with pediatric patients and their families.
Providers are in a unique position to foster this self-efficacy during visits with pediatric patients and their caregivers by addressing their concerns and providing guidance. Healthcare providers are key influencers because they are expert sources for caregivers and patients.
The first barrier caregivers have mentioned is uncertainty. This refers to feeling unsure and uncertain about where risk factors are present and how exactly to go about avoiding them.
How am I supposed to figure out what things I need to avoid?
Well, when you get home, look over the handouts we gave you and try to find some of the strategies that work the best for you. Again, it's hard to keep track of all these recommendations. Even avoiding Mackenzie's exposure to one or two of these endocrine disrupting chemicals can be beneficial.
Uncertainty refers to caregivers' uncertainty as to where risk factors are present in their environment and how exactly to go about avoiding them. So that was Brandon Walling's voice as well. You might have heard in there. Yeah, it takes a village. It's it's one of those things where, I'm not here and we needed another voiceover, and the logistics of this stuff can become really, really challenging. So we just completed the data collection just recently. And so we're just taking a look at some of the things, and even Sandy and I were consulting this morning as she ran some different data up here. So just some preliminary stuff here that people like the training. I mean, as a feasibility study, people liked it, and that's great, and they found it helpful and relevant. And this is a 1 to 5 scale. And they were just taking a look. So the design, if you remember, was a pre-test, post-test, and then another. And this is where I think this makes a big difference is we didn't just do the post-test right after the training, we followed up with them 3 to 4 weeks later. And that's an effort that doesn't generally happen, right? And so I'm excited about this preliminary stuff because this is knowledge stuff, and knowledge is certainly not the solution, does not equal behavior change at all. But at the same time, you can see sort of from time 2 to time 3, it becomes a little bit more stable, and these are significantly different, which is great, and here too. And we are taking a look at a model 2 that we're going to be writing a paper this next month to submit for the ICA deadline. So testing knowledge and attitude and intention at time 2 to predict time 3 whether they actually engaged in any of the recommended behaviors. So this was a fun project. It was a hard project because I'd never done anything like this. I've never developed training, videos and things, and it's not really on my skill set. But to have great partnerships like with WKAR and having that scientific advisory board to make sure that the science was correct were really useful pieces. So most recent, almost through the presentation here now too, is so we've done a lot of applied things, and Diffusion of Innovation sort of also framed the grant that we wrote. But Diffusion of Innovation, if you take a look, there's not lots of empirical evidence. It's more retrospective kind of stuff with that. So our thought was, let's create some videos that where one set has Diffusion of Innovation principles and the other set does not. And let's see if there's greater uptake with the Diffusion of Innovation set. We had partnered with some folks to write this opportunity grant. This is my alarm to tell me that I'm almost done. So this is great. I'm going to shut it off now. And so we manipulated the Diffusion of Innovation piece, and we created. And I'm not sure that we've done a great job in our manipulations. We still need to check and see. According to O'Keefe, we can probably make the argument for at least two of the videos in terms of this is how you define Diffusion of Innovation, and is that present? And we've got a few people saying yes and not, so there's some work there. So I'm not sure. But there's twofold things. We've got this sort of experiment. I love this kind of study and we're going to create something that hopefully is useful for educators. So it's kind of a beautiful situation. So if you take a look at, I'm just going to show you, I have to kind of do this a little differently here. I'll show you this, and then I have to pull it over here. Here we go. And then I'm gonna play it. Thank you to Dave. Let me find my cursor. Here we go. Gotta do it this way. So we'll just check this video out. I'll be done in a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Amelia, and I'm at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm talking with Desiree Walker, a health educator and advocate with BSERP. Ms. Walker, what do BSERP researchers and health advocates like you do?
BSERP is Breast Cancer and the Environment Research Program. BSERP researchers and health advocates like myself, we basically are looking to understand the environment and what impact chemicals can have in terms of breast cancer risk. Makeup, so lipstick, eyeshadow, soap, everyday products. There are chemicals that are called endocrine disruptors. And with your skin, in terms of absorption, these are ways that things can get into your body, increasing your risk. We all use sunscreen. It has parabens, but we never really think about looking at the ingredients.
What is the precautionary principle?
The precautionary principle simply encourages you to have the concept better safe than sorry. So although we may not know all the chemicals and its impact on breast cancer, we think that if you feel something could be harmful, it's better to avoid it to keep your risk low.
Why is the precautionary principle important for young girls like me?
At this stage of your life, your body is going through changes. Your breast tissue is developing and your risk starts to increase based on the exposures you have to toxins. So it's important for you to have conversation with your family in terms of your household products. Start reading labels in order to know what's in the products. There are other options out there that don't have chemicals that will actually give you the same results. And generally, it's not difficult with the internet to find alternatives. If you don't like them, try some other things. But I think it's a really great exercise in practice to avoid chemicals, even though we don't have the links and can definitively say that is what is causing the cancer. You actually doing the research to try and bring about change, not only for yourself, but for your family, you'll feel good about it. And you'll find that it will have other benefits for your health. And so keeping in mind the precautionary principle would be helpful because your actions today will have an impact on your future.
When it comes to preventing breast cancer, I learned following the precautionary principle at my age can make a difference in the future. What did you learn?
also, that was Amelia. She had a lot of lattes that morning too. So that was, yeah. And I'm gonna pull this back over here. Yeah, so anyhow, I just want to say that, a couple of things that you may or may not have noticed was some of the diffusion principles of relative advantage, benefits beyond the actual recommended, that's going to benefit the specific recommendation. So it'll leak over and you'll help you with other things and protect you from other. So we're not quite there yet. I don't know that this is going to be successful, but we're trying to find schools right now, and we did have partners, and this is one of the challenges with partnerships. So they retired, one took a new job, and one went with our partners who had school connections. So we're in the process of identifying some new schools, but we'll see. We have we're trying to, if you've got any connections, let me know, because we need to identify some teachers or Girl Scout troops or those kinds of groups who might do some health or environmental health or general health or science types of things with their groups, their students. Okay. Okay, soon to be working. Doing something wrong. Okay, let me catch out of here. Nope. Here we go. Sorry, I went way back. Here we go. Yes, here we go. So the last slide. So ongoing big challenges, how do we communicate risk associated with emerging science? And how much evidence do we need before we can communicate with some certainty, And a lot of the things we've written about have to do with uncertainty and how to manage uncertainty in these situations. And there's not I don't have the solution. And how do we engage audiences when they see words like might and may and seem? When we know they don't want to hear that. They want something much more definitive in their recommendations. And then how do we compete in the information environment? One of the things that we argued in our grant proposal for the training was that it's better than the other trainings that are out there that are just PowerPoint slides and, and doctors. And so, it's not that exciting, but it's maybe better than the certain what's out there right now. So how do we compete? And I think these are the questions that I continue to have, that even from the get-go of the project, we had, and I'm not sure that we've actually answered them. But we've got a lot of, you can go to bserp.org. It will give you abstracts for everything that's pretty much ever been published with the BSERP across the country. And then I've also included lots of our research here too, just as references. So thank you.
We have time for questions, so if people just want to raise their hand, and yes.
Well, I just wanted to point out that Cami didn't say something that was interesting. When we got the grant, we were supposed to do face-to-face training.
Yes.
So what, you want to tell how that morphed?
Right. So this is, again, goes back to be friends with your program officer, and do not skip that step, people. Do not skip that step. Do not write something unless you're going to make contact. So she was an advocate, Sima, for this from the get-go. And when we wrote it, and they had real problems with, I guess, what they thought with their study section on this particular call. And so we had said we were going to deliver the training in person and compare it to online training and see which one was much more effective. And she said, we had to get on a call with her, and she said, no, you want to frame this as a feasibility study. Well, people even show up to do a BSERP training, and our research showed that, our formative research, that they didn't want to show up at these conferences at some hotel ballroom to get there. They wanted it online. So we showed up at one of those a couple of times, and the only people who showed up, and I don't want to sound ageist, were octogenarians who want to show up face to face, and no one else really did. So it was a little bit of a waste of our time to even think about doing a face-to-face training. So this made a whole lot more sense. This was, without Sima's advocacy, this wouldn't have been funded. So that's why I mention her in the program officer piece quite a bit. Yeah. No.
So something that you sort of circled around a few times but didn't address directly is this. So my understanding is that compared to white women, Black women have similar morbidity rates, but very different mortality rates when it comes to breast cancer. Meanwhile, there's an environmental health scientist named Amizota who's been looking at the chemicals in some of the hair products that you might use if you're a Black woman. And this is getting a lot of press right now. It's been in Essence magazine, right, et cetera. And I think that it's a really important issue because now we're tying in issues of social justice and race and et cetera. Absolutely. Have you looked at your results, especially the earlier ones when you were comparing like chemical, have you looked at whether there are differences by race?
Generally, no, because we haven't had enough participants of color in our research. So no. And I think that's a really important thing to bring up, even at our annual meeting. I don't know if the other scientists are even thinking about that. Sometimes things come up, and people, the other scientists. I remember breast density came up initially. It came up for the first time 7-8 years ago. The advocates were talking about it, and all the scientists were poo-pawing whether breast density mattered. Now there are some research that's not just about obscuring breast cancer, that it actually might have a causal link to breast cancer, just having dense breasts. So there's some new research. So what I'm saying is no, and I don't think we have even had enough of a sample to probably be able to do something like that. But that's an important topic that I wouldn't be surprised is going to be brought up at this next. Seriously, if it's been in the news, our advocates are on it, right? They're so well educated, and there are these programs called LEAD programs that train advocates on understanding lab science and being like so well trained to understand what's happening, to be serving on study sections, and this all happened as part of the. I think back in the 70s was the first LEAD program to help train them. So yeah, so that's such a really good point. Yeah, I haven't even thought about that. I didn't even know about that. Wow. Other question? Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the ambiguity of the science surrounding risk. If you think about tobacco products as we move with e-cigarettes, the new heat-not-burn tobacco products that are going to be moving into the U.S., there's not a consensus, I would say, in the tobacco control community about how to communicate scientific, like what we are concerned about. So, there was a moment when e-cigarettes were supposed to be better than combustible cigarettes, and now everybody's dying and getting, lung infections. So what? I should just read your papers. I know I'm being lazy, but could you summarize for me what you think the best practice is when discussing these ambivalent scientific realities?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just going to say some basic things that everybody here can, and I feel like there's other experts here that probably have a lot to say about this. But, I think that the thing that helps, that we've always been grounded in, is the precautionary principle, right? And so that has been helpful in bolstering our ability to talk more stridently sometimes, perhaps, than what the science might show. But we can. So I think that's a big deal. I kind of, how do I say this well? There's no magic potion here, because we all.
Does everybody understand what she means when she says that? Like what? I think you should elaborate on that, because that's a super important point. Because you and I talked about this right earlier about how if you're not following the precautionary principle, scientists do not want to say until there's definitive causal evidence that breast cancer is linked to this thing that you should be worried about that thing.
Yeah.
They overcame that by agreeing as a major, as this whole team of people, that we don't have to have definitive causal evidence to be able to say, watch out for this stuff. That's a big deal. Okay, and that is what's allowed them to be so, I think, to be so successful with the translational stuff that they've done. I just wanted to reinforce that, because that, to me, it seems simple, but it's actually a big deal.
Yeah, and
lots of us are struggling with uncertain science, okay?
So the other thing, actually, I would think that's sort of in between the spaces that you guys are talking about, is that our last integration meeting, they gave us all clickers, and they wanted us all to vote on what, different statements of how much this contributes to cancer, and how much this matters, and how much, and are the links established with this, and this, and this? Nobody agreed. After 17 years, right? Yeah. Nobody agreed on what we actually know about this. So what you're, I think that you start small and grow big, and you deal with small audiences that you can figure out where they I don't know. I mean, I do not have an answer. I wish I could tell you that people don't like uncertainty. They want to be, but you can't tell them what to do. I don't know. Ashley. I don't have a good answer. I know, there's no magic bullet, but I do think high quality messages matter, and I'm just going to go back to campaign stuff 101. High quality messages matter from a credible source that are designed well and hopefully theoretically driven, which I didn't really give much of a focus on the theoretical piece, but we really do use a strong evidence base of science, but also include constructs, and sometimes we are more inclusive of an entire theory in our approach, but the constructs we know that resonate across multiple theories in our message construction. So, and we've found that, if people don't care about the issue, you can't bother so much. You can't invest resources and time. So I'm for the fence riders. It's just like sort of political, stuff. Like you're not going to change a Democrat tomorrow, right? You're going to go with the fence riders and try to influence their vote, right? It's the same thing. I think it's the same principle. I'm a very lay approach here. You've noticed over the years, I think I've developed that. Yeah, you Sandy.
Just one comment. The precautionary principle has been adopted in the EU as the standard.
Yeah, the trick with tobacco control is we can't do that because we'll get sued. Yeah, and so that's why I like this. I agree. We should not use things when we don't know what they do to our bodies, but I can't make a message that says that because having been sued by an e-cigarette company, I am not making that mistake again.
But also, like you notice in the videos too, we know there's certain products that are better, and I can't put them in this video because it's promoting a product, right? And so, or I'm telling that product, your product is bad, and so I'm going to get sued. Like exactly what you're saying. So that's why you see these nondescript fragrance bottles, and when you know Teflon is a problem, right? Like don't use Teflon, folks. Don't do it, right? It's not. Don't microwave your food. Don't microwave plastic. Don't even put it in your what?
You're being live streamed. Don't get sued.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
So the precautionary principle is awesome, right? But you brought up the sunscreen example, and so there are limitations there when reducing one risk causes another. Yes. And BPA, which is something you brought up, is an interesting example because there was a time when people, advocates, were calling for no more BPA linings in canned foods, right? Except for that doubles your risk of foodborne illness because you just cut the shelf life more than half, right? And so, these are tough issues. Like, how do you talk about that issue when you could cause a different problem?
And we talk a lot about this at these conferences too.
Yeah.
We really do. And I think that it's the weighing these risks depending on what your risk tolerance is as an individual, which is why these things can't seem to ever scale up to population level, right? It's always left in your lap as the mom, as the person, to engage in whatever the recommended behavior is. So Monique, you get to choose whether you want to be the organic farmer in your backyard and growing everything, even though it's going to get contaminated because Joe next door is using GMOs, right? So you're going to try to do these things, and yeah, it may or may not work. I mean, these are, we've been putting this together and kind of piece it all. It's like, what have we learned after all this time? And I'm like, oh, it's hard. That's what I've learned. Yeah.
Is it more about raising skepticism? I mean, that's the education, right? If you're able to raise people's skepticism about what they're using, then maybe it will become an easier vehicle for other messages and elaboration. So does that come up, or people's skepticism about these products increases, decreases?
Yeah, I mean, raising involvement, yes, we've certainly looked at that, but not skepticism as sort of. I don't think we've really kind of tried that angle. The angle that we do try a lot in our messages is bundling, so that if you do this behavior, you're going to have a benefit across this, and this. Not only will it decrease your breast cancer risk, but it'll also decrease your cardiovascular risk, and it'll, and that kind of thing. But the skepticism, I don't know. I don't think so. I wouldn't frame what we've done along that. But I guess skepticism in terms of you should be reading those labels, and you should be, but not directly. I don't think we're directly trying to nail that. So that's an interesting thought. Even Mo's guilt stuff earlier, I thought about that. And we did have some some messages, I think, that you wouldn't do this, blah, blah. We certainly have gone down that road too a little bit. Yeah.
Have you done anything around looking at like if there's a difference in how people receive it, if there's sort of like a sense of control versus not having control over exposure?
Yeah, so there's some good, I'm sure you probably know there's some good models out there that talk about the importance of your behavioral control, TPB or whatever. And we, and so your question is, have we looked at control over the behavior?
Right.
And you can see it, I think in some of our evidence, you can see, but people are less responsive when they think they don't have control over it. So yeah.
If I got it right, you mentioned if people have open questions about alternative products and how they can find more information, the message is Google it. So the point is that in the Google universe, you have a lot of contradicting messages.
Sure.
So how do they find? How do they navigate? How do they evaluate? Isn't this a real task to help people with?
Absolutely.
Because actually they are completely exposed to ambiguous information, contradictory information,
Yeah.
too much information, not knowing how to evaluate the source. Website can look perfect. What's behind it? Maybe just a product advertisement.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I agree. I mean, it's a to sort through what's the credible information and what's not. I think our advocacy groups generally aren't overly radical. There was a time early on where I thought they were, but I trust certain advocacy groups. So I would recommend some of them, and I would recommend the traditional government sources. The American Cancer Society, the CDC. Those are go-to places for information. But I think you're right. I mean, the media literacy piece and health literacy piece of where to get that information, because there are some crazy things out there about any particular health issue that you should be really skeptical about. So it is a lot. And again, it goes back to how to scale this up in a way that's not sitting in the individual's lap to have to sort through pages and pages of information. But there are some more credible sources, and certainly the websites. I think the Witten paper back in the day really took a look at what it was beyond just. It was like the theoretical constructs that were there. She did a pretty good analysis with her grad students of websites that might be more or less credible. And then even recently, we can't seem to get this paper published, but it's another content analysis looking at websites and what types of websites. So what's the organization? Is it a government website or is it a industry website? And whether they actually talk at all about environmental exposures. And there's definitely just a lack, quite frankly, still a lack, other than advocacy sites, of a lot of information about environmental factors on these websites. I mean, it's a paucity of it. I mean, it's really, really low. So if you're looking for it, it'd be hard to find. And so government websites, I think people still have enough trust in our country anyhow, in the CDC, in particular in the American Cancer Society. Yeah.
Related to that, in the last video you showed the kid video, right? There's I don't know if it's explicit or implicit, but there certainly is an expectation of essentially children going on the internet and turning into advocates for themselves. And so I'm curious if the efficacy of that suggestion and their literacy toward the kinds of sources that they might find is a thing that you're currently evaluating.
No, we're not. And I think you're absolutely right, because so many of our advocacy groups have all these training programs and they're in schools, and they're trying to make mini advocates out of young girls. There are peer education programs. So there's clearly this movement of that happening. But no, sorry, that was probably me. So no, we're not. And it's a good avenue to be concerned about.
Sorry.
No, that's good. Go Go ahead.
Can I? Yeah. So also related, did you check for differences in reactions to those messages among people with higher versus lower socioeconomic status? Because people with, who live on a budget might not be able to have a choice choosing things without those parabens and other chemicals, etc.
And that does come up a lot.
Or internet connection.
Yeah, and especially with a lot of the qualitative research where we're much more conscious, I think, of getting some representation of other groups. That came up often as a big challenge. And I don't, I'm sure we always, you kind of do it sort of the standard thing to sort of check for whether it's making a difference, whether race or, and I don't recall that we see big differences, but I do know that is, a relevant issue that people talk about a lot in our meetings and on our calls. So, but no, we haven't really, I think, made a concerted effort to say we're going to go do that, take a look and see what the big differences are. We haven't. We've mostly had a lot of a little bit older advocate, white participants in our studies, and in our moms, often white mothers, we just seem to have a preponderance. So, yeah.
There's one other group besides the scientists and the advocates, communication researchers, and they're the epidemiologists. And they're doing studies they started 17 years ago with the same cohorts of young girls who are now 17 years older. But some of them are in Harlem, and so they really are taking into account a lot of the social factors of health and things like that. So that's another part of this triad that's in this project.
And they have found in Cincinnati in particular that folks who lived along this particular river had higher rates of PAHs or something in their blood, and it was a more lower income area and stuff. So it's clearly the case where there's disparities in terms of measures. So, yeah. Great.
Yeah. So, because you talk about BPA a lot as a chemical that we should avoid, but I'm wondering, are you the reason that everything that I buy with plastic says?
Absolutely.
Research into action,
absolutely
right
not.
here.
No.
And then the sunscreens this summer has come out, and I've seen a lot more on the sunscreens, and I feel like the sunscreens are doing it dual. Like, one, this chemical causes cancer, and two, it ruins, coral.
Yeah. Yeah, that was exciting when that happened. Let me tell you why. So, they banned to sell sunscreen in Hawaii, right? Because it was damaging the coral reef. I mean, that's the kind of help that we need to make the point, right? Because wow, you can't buy certain sunscreens in Hawaii, right? I mean, that's amazing. That's a policy change that has incredible impact on, and it's going to save the reef and whatever. So, yeah. No, we weren't responsible for BPA, but we were able to say a lot about BPA because it's one of the early chemicals that they were studying, and it's, we've been around the block with it a bit. So there's a little more certainty with that. I'd like to think we helped out, but it's certainly not. Yeah. Yeah.
There's one more question. Yeah. You want to ask your question? Yeah, I was wondering about policy and advocacy work around this, and it kind of goes into that the previous question. If your advocates or anyone involved in this project have been able to communicate these messages to lawmakers and people in positions of power to advocate for any sort of consumer protections.
Yeah. So this is an interesting tension too, because we work closely with the agencies, and so you see a lot of the NCI and NIHS folks, and they sort of steer clear of some of this, right? And the scientists do as well, often, and so it's really up to the advocates to kind of make that. So there are clearly, and I wish I was more aware of what all of our advocate partners are doing across the country, but clearly the Long Island group that we work with were literally the folks who lobbied Congress for the resources. But I haven't seen, I don't know that I've seen policy papers come out of our group, nor that I know all of the activities. I get a sense that some of these groups exist for that purpose, because there's got to be 8 or 9 different advocacy groups that are part of the BSERP, and some of them do go and appear before Congress, and some of them do go and visit and knock on doors, and they have an annual, breast cancer push for stuff. So I think it's happening. I don't think I'm very aware of what the specifics are, though. Hey, Ron. Yes, I'm saving the world.
This leads to a lot of the questions that focus on this cause of cancer and that cause of cancer. In my mind, that's not got a lot to do with your part in all of this. So I guess I'm trying to see your part. It seems that your part is a way to best practices for communicating best practices. Is that it? Yeah. Because if that's what it is, I wonder what are the best practices what are the best practices that you have identified in order to communicate best practices to others? Because that would seem to be the part that you would be most expert on.
Yeah. So I think, I feel like it's not been as formalized as that, Ron. I feel like when we show up, for a long time we were sort of put with the advocates, and so then we sort of took on this role. And then you start realizing that you're the only person in the room that actually does any kind of research or has any research training at all. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to, we've done trainings at conferences, like campaign stuff 101, Ron, truly. Clarity of message, simple message, white space, addressing uncertainty as best you can. Using theoretical constructs, getting designers. I cannot tell you, I think that is an enormous issue, because we create crap a lot and it's not good enough. It's not good enough to influence or get anybody's attention. Fact sheets, kind of a colossal waste of time. And some of you can, for folks, right? Because that's what all of our health comm students are asked to do half the time by the state. And so you're going to hand them out, and people are going to put them in the trash, that's so yeah, we've done a lot of that. And so for me, clear, sort of the health literacy principles of creating messages, using simple terms, using definitions when things aren't, even multi-syllable words. These are not things that I need to come up with. They exist already for best practices. So we just try to advocate for them as communication researchers in these groups. It's like, hey, there's better ways to do what you're doing. But some of these folks are great. They have resources to be able to get professionals to help them to design. But the thing that I feel like maybe the biggest thing that we've been able to push and help people understand is that there's a beautiful relationship between theory and practice. And if you're thinking about this set of issues, like the self-efficacy and the response efficacy and the uncertainty and all of those things, that's going to drive a better message. And so even next month when I do the annual conference, I'm on a panel about uncertainty, myths, and messages that someone else, the fact that they even recognize uncertainty, that it exists, in this kind of way is I think real progress. So I'm going to talk about uncertainty theories as part of this panel. So it's sort of that educational piece too. I don't know that I answered your question, but yeah.
I think perhaps this question is on behalf of the population outside the U.S., specifically on Southeast Asia, where vulnerable people with breast cancer is the second most dangerous disease as well. And this is a very alien concept for us, environment to breast cancer people, basically to most Cambodian people. And I don't know a lot about this, but how do you see this as a possibility that this can be disseminated worldwide? Because this is an incredible work. Yeah.
No, I think that we have some partners who have been dealing with Chile and some other international groups. So I think that it can sort of bleed there. But so the future, Maria said, what's going to happen? So the BSERP is kind of winding down right now. We've only got about this is the last year, and then there's another probably a year of no cost extension funding. And I don't know what's going to happen, but to internationalize this more could be a direction that a lot of people go. So I I think it could, but I think the advocacy groups in Cambodia, for instance, would do well to reach out to advocacy groups in the U.S. because that's where probably the greatest potential lies, at least at the moment, in terms of spreading some important environmental exposure information.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Cammy for. For coming today. I have a couple of quick announcements. First, today in 1962, Silent Spring was released by Rachel Carson, which started the modern environmental movement. So this is a great topic to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Secondly, and much less serious, the homecoming parade for Michigan State has been canceled tonight, but the party at Beggar's Banquet has not been canceled. So if you were planning on going to Beggar's Banquet, and all our guests are welcome to that, the Dean's office is hosting a party there. There'll be food and cash bar and sodas and all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested, please feel free to stop by. It starts at 5:30. Right? Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is live streamed, everybody, and available on our website. So just so you know.